Cool. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming to this talk. This seems like a really cool program. I'm excited to chat with many of you later on. I'll be around for maybe the next day or so after this. So like a pretty quick trip, but yeah, excited to hear any thoughts you have on this line of research. So the broad idea of this talk is, well, let me give some background context. So I started off my career as a research engineer. I'm doing more hands-on stuff. And then pretty quickly, I felt a sense that the whole field was pretty confused about some pretty core concepts like AGI, like alignment, what we even mean by misalignment versus alignment. And so in the like 6 or so years since then, I've been investigating this question in various ways. Sorry, who turned that off? Cool. Yeah, so I've been in various places. I like left DeepMind to try and do a philosophy PhD, just like trying to understand these sort of core concepts better. Decided that over in SF was a better place to start thinking about this, and then especially over the last year and a half when I've been an independent researcher, I feel like I've gained a lot of conceptual clarity, and in particular on the angle that I'm currently pursuing, which is trying to understand agents as coalitions of sub-agents. So compared with other directions in agent foundations, some researchers are trying to look at an environment or look at the world and pick out, which parts of the world are agents and which aren't agents. And I'm not really doing that. I'm saying, given that we have some collection of agent-like things, how can we talk about their collaboration, competition, and the emergent dynamics that lead to larger scale agents forming from that collection of sub-agents? Ideally, I would like to identify scale-free properties that arise. So the ways in which competition between sub-agents leads to, like within an agent leads to their agent, and then between agents leads to larger scale agents like companies or nations or communities or civilizations. As that's sort of the very big picture goal. In this talk, I will be mostly focusing on 3 things. I'll be focusing on the concept of identity as a way of bridging from our default paradigm of individual agents to group agents. And then give like 3 puzzles which motivate me digging into this concept of identity, or 3 ways in which the standard conception of rational agents seems to be missing something. And then I'll zoom out a bit and talk about, okay, if you take this idea on board, if you start thinking of the world in terms of group agents, what does that let you do? Or how does that change the larger scale way that you view the world? This is still pretty high level stuff. Like I don't have like many concrete results in here. It's more like trying to point you at the direction that I'm interested in that will hopefully yield fruitful research progress later on. But first, before I get into that, I just want to say a little bit about like why I'm doing any of this research. So people often ask me for like, what's my theory of impact? How do I think that this research will be useful? And I mostly reject this framing. I think that there's something, the role of alignment research really seems to be continuing a long-standing thread in AI. So I think historically when AI was founded, there were these 2 strands. There were people who were trying to understand and also to build intelligent agents. And I guess I think of deep learning as, in some sense, giving up on the first strand, saying, well, we don't know what's inside neural networks, but they work, so we're just going to like throw all our resources at them. And so in some sense, I want to say the last few decades of AI have been a retreat from the notion of a scientific field towards something that I call more of an engineering field. And then I think of alignment research in particular as trying to get back towards that like conception of a scientific field by saying, well, actually our goal is to understand the deep principles by which these agents work. Like because alignment research tries to generalize a long way, and the only way you can generalize a very long way is by having a deep understanding of fundamental principles, like in biology or in physics or chemistry and so on. And when I think about central examples of alignment research, like MECINTERP or agent foundations, kind of the only thing they actually have in common is that they're both focused on fundamental understanding, right? Like MECINTERP could be used for all sorts of things. It could be used for alignment, safety, capabilities, like applications, whatever. Like it really seems like the best way of understanding what the field should be trying to do is by focusing on understanding. And I kind of have a hypothesis that if we understand the alignment problem deeply enough, that actually gets you most of the way towards solving the alignment problem. So basically, I'm just trying to understand what the problem is and how I can even talk about stuff like, is this agent misaligned, or what would it mean for an agent to be aligned? Yeah.
So just to like make it like for clarity and explicitness, you would like exclude stuff like inoculation prompting from alignment research because it's not trying to like understand things much.
Yeah, I think like, look, there's some possibilities in which stuff is like really useful in short time frames, but it just seems like really the wrong mindset to be in, to be trying to do like quirky stuff and sacrifice this kind of long-term principled thinking, especially for people in this room. And like the entire world is like panicking and freaking out about short timelines and trying to do hacky things. And like, especially here, I was like, man, I really want people to try and do the most principled thinking that they can. Yeah, one more question on this, and then I'll move on to the main content. Yeah.
I wanted to kind of dispute that, in that I think that inoculation prompting comes from a line of like persona science of model psychology, and this is, I guess, a prediction of these theories, and it seems to work very well. And so, yeah, I think that like this kind of science of understanding the minds of these systems will lead to more empirical methods for.
Yep, that seems right. This talk is in some sense my conception of what a like really rigorous persona science should look like persona science that links personas to things like concept like rational agency in terms of expected utility and so on. Cool. So let's dig into that. So here we have a like diagram of what I call a classically rational agent. I'm going to call it economically rational agent as well. You have beliefs, you have goals, and the beliefs are probably credences, probability distributions, and the goals are utility functions. And you pick actions that maximize your achievement of your goals according to your beliefs. So this seems like pretty simple and basic, but I think as soon as we move into the multi-agent paradigm, things start to get more complicated, because now you have one agent that has beliefs about the other agent's beliefs and beliefs about the other agent's goals, and it might have goals about what the other agent believes and goals about what the other agent wants. And you start to get this messy kind of recursion going on, where the agents are reasoning about each other and doing this like multi-layer modeling of how each other thinks. And how do you handle this in classic, the classic paradigm? I don't really think there are great ways of doing this. I would say that the way that the standard paradigm handles this, there are at least two things here, I guess. One is that you just say, well, actually, you're still a rational agent. You're still a like individual agent with beliefs and goals. We just like shove some extra beliefs and some extra goals in there. So in the beliefs, we put this common knowledge of rationality as a way of dealing with these multi-agent interactions. So this is, I think, a pretty load-bearing assumption when it comes to multi-agent interactions, like in game theory. I also think it's just straightforwardly wrong, or at least it's like the version of it that is standardly used is just way too strong, because it implies this kind of crazy level of knowing, me knowing that you knowing, I know that you know that everyone here is rational. And then in terms of preferences, well, you can put preferences about other agents in the utility function, but you can't really get a lot of the types of preferences you might want, because you don't have that, again, you don't have that recursive component of like, maybe I have preferences about how you reason about me. Maybe I have preferences about how our decisions are entangled with each other. These kinds of things are pretty hard to pin down. And I'll say all of this a bit more precisely later on. This is kind of like a broad gesture of something I think is going wrong. Yes.
There is epistemic game theory,
Yeah.
right? Which does model these beliefs in a kind of recursive way.
Yeah, I think this is not sufficiently principled, and I'll talk later on about like why, like what I think a like more principled version of it would look like. Cool. And so one way that people, especially in this field, have tried to address this is by saying, well, look, the individualist paradigm is broken, but we can fix it using something like functional decision theory, or like updateless decision theory, in which the agents start to like account for the correlations between their decisions. But I think this is still too individualistic. Like you still have the same structure of like, an individual agent has its beliefs, it has its goals, and you're just like changing the decision theory a little bit in order to account for how all the entanglements between the agent's beliefs and goals. So I don't think this gets us where we want to go, which is part of why I think decision theory has kind of stagnated since people originally introduced FDT and UDT. So again, later in this talk, I'll say a little more about what I think a better approach might be that sort of fixes the approaches decision theory from a more fundamental perspective. So here are the puzzles I want to walk through. So that's like the high level intuition. Now I'm like more concretely, what might you think is missing from the standard paradigm that we can fix by talking in terms of identity? First one, you can see these three up there. I'll just go through them one by one. But basically, how do players, or how should players, like get into a game theoretic equilibrium in the first place? So in game theory, I claim that there's a lack of good accounts of players recursively modeling each other. And one way we can see this is when we look at the role of equilibria in the idea of the definition of equilibria in game theory. So when we think about equilibria, you're basically dodging most of the role of like how agents update about each other. Like if I'm in an equilibrium, I'm like certain, like it's a point where I'm certain what you're going to do, you're certain what I'm going to do, and then we don't need to model very much about how we update each other. And so I think one indication of what's missing here is a principal definition of Schelling points. So Schelling points, the point where two agents would converge to without any communication. It's like a very standard notion in historically in game theory. But basically, I think there's the level of recursive modeling that you need to do in order to define a Schelling point. The tools don't really exist to tackle that right now. And so you have like some definitions of Schelling points that say, well, a Schelling point is the equilibrium that like jumps out to both players, or it's the simplest equilibrium. But that's not actually a good way of thinking about Schelling points. A better way of thinking about Schelling points is, it's the equilibrium, it's inherently recursive. It's the equilibrium that I think that you think that I think that you think that we're going to land on. And I think the thing that's missing here, and I think is also missing from like this kind of epistemic game theory, is the idea of like the actions that you take in order to influence which equilibria you end up in the future. So let me give a sort of intuitive example here. Suppose I'm an alcoholic, right? So every day I really want to drink, but let's say I have a hyperbolic discount rate. So like my ideal would be that I drink today and then I'm sober for the rest of my life, right? Because I don't want to spend my whole life as an alcoholic. But then I know tomorrow my ideal preference would be that I drink that day and then I'm sober again for the rest of my life. So how do you solve this coordination problem? Well, the way, I think this is hard to solve in the classic setting. The way that alcoholics actually seem to solve the problem is by having a streak. So you say, look, I haven't drunk for 6 months, or I haven't drunk for a year. If I drink tomorrow, or if I drink today, then I'm going to be breaking my streak, and therefore there's going to be no credible way of committing to not drinking tomorrow, right? So like the action of drinking, the main effect that it has is going to be of influencing the credibility of your predictions about your future self. Chris, question over there.
So it seems to me like another obvious modification to the setting is that like the domain of choice of the agent is not the action but the policy. Like you choose a policy, which like involves you not drinking ever, because it has like higher expected utility for like whatever future. Do you also consider this like somewhat of something like an in-principle patch?
Yeah, so I don't think this is a good direction, because in some sense the whole problem is like, how do you manage to choose on a policy level? Like here I am, I'm making a decision. Like what makes me think that this decision will actually change my policy? And similarly, when people talk about like, oh, maybe you can make a commitment to not drinking. In some sense, the whole problem is like, how do I make a commitment? Like if I just say really loudly, I commit to not drinking, like in some cases, my future self will pay attention to that. For example, if on New Year's Eve, I say, for the whole next year, I'm not going to drink, that's a more credible commitment than if on a random Tuesday, I wake up and I'm like, I'm not going to drink this next year. Why? Because one of them is more of a Schelling point and the other one is not. One of them like lets you, I think, maybe for the sake of time, let's continue this later on. Let me just finish the answer and then go there. Yes, I think one of these, like a lot of what humans do intuitively is, I think, trying to manage their predictive self models of like which commitments to themselves are credible and which aren't. When I think about like, I'm trying to give a good talk, partly so that I think of myself as a competent and intelligent person. Like, why do I want to think of myself as a competent and intelligent person? So that like my future self will have like more optionality going forward about like what kinds of equilibria they find themselves in. That's a sort of like broad picture that I'm trying to convey here. Another question.
So when I was looking at like alcohol dependence and what methods work and which methods don't, the thing that seemed to work by far the most effectively was tapering compared to like
Sorry, I missed the word there. You said the thing that works most effectively is
tapering,
tapering.
as in like a gradual reduction. So like going from like drinking every day to drinking like every other day and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
How does that kind of like pair with like the idea that that the thing that makes them feel good is having a streak? Because surely like if someone is like, if you look at like tapering have as a 70% effectiveness rate.
Yeah.
And so how does that work with like saying, oh my streak is so good, that's the reason like why I don't want to do it. It's like, is that just like that's the stated thing, or like what's the like evidence like for this kind of thing?
So I think I'm somewhat agnostic on how you get into the no drinking equilibrium.
Sure.
I'm pretty confident that once you're in the no drinking equilibrium, it is much better for you to have zero drinking than it is to have like a little bit of drinking like on special occasions. And basically that's because one of those Schelling points is much more defensible than the other Schelling point. If you're like, oh, I'm going to make an exception like on my birthday and then also on Christmas and then also like on the new year, then you start to lose the ability to defend the equilibrium that you've gotten to. So I don't know, empirically, like, I don't know, a lot of people seem to like go stone cold sober. Maybe tapering seems to empirically work, I'm not sure. The more confident, the thing I'm more confident in is that a lot of the dynamics of how to move between equilibria involve finding an equilibrium that's like very defensible. In the sense that I think we don't know how to describe mathematically yet. I don't think we have the tools to say this equilibrium is like more defensible than other equilibria. Cool. Yeah. One more question now.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if I understand why you're using the term Schelling points to describe these sort of equilibria. To me, they sound like attractor basins, and your point about some Schelling points being more defensible than others just sounds like this attractor basin is deeper and like more resistant to like change, and it can better return to that state. And Schelling point to me, like I understand it as something like if you don't have common knowledge of something, like what do you infer to? So
This is a great question.
Yeah.
Two responses. Firstly, when you're talking about the attractor basin, the question is the attractor basin of what dynamics? And to me, it's the dynamics of reasoning about which predictions your future self will think that you think that they will follow if you make them. So that's where this kind of like Schelling-like dynamic comes in. I agree this is not literally a Schelling point. I think a term that might be better in some ways is Schelling fence. But Schelling actually discusses this exact point in his book. So he says, there's this dynamic of like trying to figure out what, like where your expectations converge under zero communication. But then even when you have some amounts of communication, you still have many of the same dynamics because some places of where you might converge are sort of more credible than others. So if we do have some communication and we're trying to figure out where to meet, and I immediately say like, and I say something really that's like very non-plausible, like, oh, we should meet at the place that gives me all the utility and you none of the utility, you're just going to ignore me. So in some sense, the generalization of from zero communication to the case where you have some communication but you don't fully trust their communication is a lot of what I'm interested in exploring. And similarly here, like the alcoholic example is not like a fully like technically a Schelling point because the alcoholic can communicate with his future self. It's just that the future self doesn't believe what they're saying unless the alcoholic tries to communicate a like Schelling point. Like the future self doesn't believe I'm going to stop drinking for the rest of my life on this random Tuesday because I felt like it. But they might believe, oh, it's like the lowest point in my life. It's New Year's Eve. Like from now on, I'm making a shift. Cool. Let's keep going. So I think I've like sort of broadly communicated the thing I'm pointing at. I think I haven't like given the kind of argument that should make you believe that there's something like rarely broken in the existing setup because like as some people mentioned, there are like various different frameworks that like try to address some aspects of this. I'll talk a little later on about why I think logical induction in particular is the most principled way to try and address this kind of thing. But yeah, hopefully that conveys some gesture of like this first puzzle. Like how do you move between equilibria? How do you update when in some sense there's this fundamental arbitrariness, like I'm taking actions because of the effects that I think they'll have on you and vice versa. Yeah, and so this thing that we're talking about, like in the case of an alcoholic, like when they say I'm sober, like the most natural way to think about that is as an identity. So like I have a predictive self model of myself, and I'm trying to pick the kind of predictive self model that lets me coordinate with my future selves. And of course, identities, like the most basic case of this is just a personal identity. Like I think of myself as the same person over time. You can also have group identities, like I'm American or New Zealander, or I'm religious in a certain way. And my claim is that there's something like very similar going on here, that you have that is going to create the ability to coordinate with other agents and to converge on certain equilibria. And so I've just drawn this diagram. I haven't really, like, in the original version of this diagram, we knew what the arrows meant. Here we don't know what the arrows meant, so I'll try and like fill in a little more intuition for what I think is going on with these arrows. But the sort of core idea is that, yeah, instead of, is that the role of this predictive self model, which I'm calling identity, is in fact crucial in how the coordination happens that build up from individual agents to these larger scale group agents. One more question before I go on to the second puzzle.
It seems like something interesting here is that it requires you to be constrained in some sense about what kinds of predictions you can make. If you could like arbitrarily predict your self model, then you wouldn't be able to instantiate this kind of coordination.
Yes, if you can, well, it depends on the correlations between the beliefs of different agents. So if I could form I could form any self model I want, but then I'm going to keep getting evidence over time. And so maybe that just breaks the self model. And I think if you think of humans as like mostly doing ego defense, like a lot of what people do is like fundamentally about maintaining their self-image, maintaining their ego. Basically, the thing that people seem to be doing is picking the best self-image that they can protect from the actual empirical evidence that keeps coming in. So if I'm like, oh, I'm such a confident, such an attractive, such a like successful person, like I'm going to calibrate that to the level where if I get rejected, it's not just going to totally break my identity.
Do you think that agents with weird updating schemes that don't look quite Bayesian when it comes to their self models would still be able to like could instantiate weirder versions of this?
Well, in some sense, the thing I'm describing of like shielding yourself against information is the non-Bayesian thing, right? Like that sort of seems like the interesting version of non-Bayesianism, where you have a bunch of information and sometimes you let it in, but sometimes you sort of block it out a little. And I think I'll give more of a like precise sense of what's going on there a little later on, or at least an intuition. But none of this is very precise. Cool. Puzzle 2. So I've talked about these like predictive self models, and it's like, okay, so as you've got this identity that's a predictive self model that says, hey, I am going to do this thing. I'm the kind of person who does this, and that's a coordination tool. But there's a question of like, okay, how does that fit with utility maximization, right? Like once you have your model of yourself, does that just like override your like expected utility calculations? That seems kind of irrational, but it also seems like if you're just doing standard utility calculations, then there's no room for the identity. And so this is like the standard picture of decision theory where there's no room for an identity. It just says you do your expected utility calculations, you take the you just like figure out which action maximizes expected utility, you just take that action. So here blue is a belief, and then the purplish thing is like the action that you take. And basically all of decision theory, or like most of decision theory, seems to be arguing about what we mean by this take action clause in there, right? So like when I say take action, do I mean that you condition on the action being taken? Do you do a like do operator on the action? Do you like set your policy which leads to this action? Like all these different things. And I'm more interested in the question of, okay, even given whatever belief you have, why is it that belief that hooks into your decision? Like, so there's a step of you form all these beliefs, like this is the utility maximizing action, but then why does the belief this is the utility maximizing action actually, or how does it lead you to actually take that action? And this may seem a little like obtuse, like, well, of course, it just should an irrational agent. But there are a couple of reasons to think that there's something a little suspicious here. Like, for one, I often form the belief this is the utility maximizing action, and then I don't take the action. So that's a little weird, right? It seems like there's something else going on here that isn't accounted for in this like very simple diagram. That like there are these two things going on of the utility calculation and something else that like overrides the actual actions I take in a sense. And you might think, well, Richard, that's just because you're irrational, right? Like, if you were rational, you would take the utility maximizing action like all the time, whenever you had a belief about it. But I want a conception of rationality that degrades gracefully, given that I'm irrational. I sort of want to see, hey, this is what I'm doing, and here's how, in the limit, I can become more and more rational. And right now, in this sort of standard account of decision theory, I don't know how to do that. But what else happens in the standard account of decision theory is that, interestingly, you can also have, if you have an agent that has like some kind of self-knowledge, it might have all sorts of beliefs about how it works. It might have the belief that it's a utility maximizer, for example. It might have the belief, given that I'm a utility maximizer and given that A is the best action, I'm probably going to take A. But this doesn't really, the weird thing about this sort of standard picture of how decisions get made is that these beliefs don't actually influence your decisions at all. They're sort of like this weird epiphenomenal thing. You might have this like belief that you take A, but implicitly the way that we model actions being taken is just by saying, well, like only the belief about the utility maximizing action up there in the top left is the thing that influences the decision. And the sort of the alternative that I want to suggest, which I call the self-prediction account, and this is like sort of spiritually related to predictive processing and various other self-prediction type things in RL, is just, okay, what if there's a different thing that hooks into the beliefs? Like, what if we model decision theory as the process of becoming confident that you will take an action, and then that's the thing that actually takes, that leads you to actually take the action. And so all of the things in blue up here, they're all epistemic, right? It's like, oh, I believe that this is the utility maximizing action. I believe that I will take the utility maximizing action. Therefore, I believe that I will take A. The only difference is this arrow that in either case we don't understand, of how do some beliefs lead you to actually act, whereas other beliefs don't actually lead you to act. And the nice thing about the self-predictive account, I claim, is that it actually lets you feed in a bunch of different considerations that aren't just utility maximization into your decision theory. So you might have just all sorts of things that let you, influence your belief about whether or not you'll take an action. You might have instincts that steer your actions. You might have commitments that you've made. You might have like this identity in the bottom right corner, like, oh, I'm the kind of person who takes this action. You might have beliefs that you're just going to succeed no matter what. So this is more of a predictive processing type thing up here, when the desired outcome will happen. And all of these, just on a purely epistemic level, can just feed into your prediction about what action you're going to take. And so I sort of think of this as a better model of what's actually going on in not yet fully rational agents, which then in the limits can converge to utility maximization if all of these different considerations can be accounted for in the arguments, basically. It's like you can get more and more things that you can account for using explicit utility calculations. But if, for example, you're in a setting where other agents are just as smart as you, and so whatever reasoning you do about the utility of taking an action is not going to account for like their cognition, then you can use your identity, right? You can be like, I'm the kind of person who takes A, and that's the kind of thing that's rational in this multi-agent environment. Cool. Now I will pause for questions. You have one.
Thank you very much for the talk. I don't know if I've missed something, but there have been kind of like moments where you've put out what you mean by identity.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could just kind of like give like an overview of how you view identity. And I'd
Yeah.
also be particularly interested in what parts of it do you think are abstractable away from the human case?
Yeah.
To like agents in general.
So I think of identity as a predictive self model that lets you move into better game theoretic equilibria. But because I don't yet, because I can't define it precisely yet, because I don't understand the dynamics by which something like an identity, like how you move between equilibria. Yeah, but the core thing seems to be it's a belief about what you will do, such that if a bunch of other agents have that belief, you can all like reach a good equilibrium together. Yeah. And you maybe think of it as like a weakening of common knowledge of rationality. Like common knowledge of rationality is like extremely strong, but if you had instead something like common knowledge of shared identity, like that's the kind of thing that that's the kind of direction that I think might be a good way of weakening this assumption.
Thank you.
So it seems to me like two aspects of, I think, your concept of identity like stand out to me. First one is that it's something like complementary heuristics that you like use to like augment your like approximate expected utility calculations insofar as you are unable to like actually like pull out the actual argmax. And the other one is like something shaped like the mind is created already in motion, and that like that the mind embodies a certain sort of modus ponens, and like those various things that you list here are like various like ways to view and certain embodied modus ponens.
Yeah.
Like I have like two questions. First, like why exactly do you think that it makes sense to like bind those two aspects together into one concept of identity? And the second one is like the second aspect, the like modus ponens like one. Why do you think that it makes sense to view it as like as something like an epistemic state?
Yeah, cool. So I think there's a connection here in like nighty and uncertainty. So there's a question of like, when should I follow my instincts? Well, evolution gave me a bunch of instincts, and I don't know how they work. I don't know why they work. I don't know if following my instincts will like lead to a certain outcome or a certain amount of utility, but it might still be rational to follow my instincts, because this process that's smarter than me like gave me a bunch of instincts. And so similarly, there's a similar kind of nighty and uncertainty when you think about other agents that are as smart or smarter than you. And so it seems like there's something kind of related going on where you need these considerations that can't be cashed out in expected utility terms to be able to feed into a decision in a way that's a sort of combines with the utility calculations in a principled way. Yeah, I think that's kind of the thing that I'm trying to do here. I'm saying like, hey, this is a mechanism that's somewhat principled by which you might be able to combine like which reduces to the Bayesian setting in the case where you can fully model the environment, you can fully model the hypotheses, but when you can't fully model the hypotheses in your environment, then you also have these heuristics and identities and so on feeding in. Yeah. Well, one more question on the slide, and then I do want to move on for time reasons. Yeah. He had a question there. Cool. Yeah.
So, if I'm understanding your conception of identity correctly, you're saying that agents form identities so that like they can coordinate with each other, basically, if they have the same identities.
Yep.
Do you think if agents have different identities, they can find points of coordination?
I think that a lot of the work of coordination is in taking multiple identities and finding the common ground between them. Like you and I have different identities, but we might talk to each other and we might find, oh, we both care about like behaving ethically. We both care about pursuing truth. And then that lets us coordinate in a way that, like in a way that we can like take actions without knowing exactly how like the utility of my action flows through your actions, but because our policies might be correlated enough. Like I'm giving a talk like that's, I'm not sure if this is a great example, but I'm giving a talk without talking very much about like why I expect it to have impact. And part of this is like, okay, I think I'm a curious person, you're all curious people, I'm just gonna like coordinate with the curious parts of you, and then like not coordinate with the utility maximizing parts of you. And then, like I don't know if this is quite right, but that's the sort of maybe this part of the spirit of it.
So it's like a shorthand for your utility function almost.
Well, the utility, I think the predictive self model of being curious, like I am a curious person, can't be cashed out as a utility function. It's just a prediction about the kinds of things that my future self will do that then leads me to be able to coordinate with my future self better. Yeah. Cool. Let's move on. And again, I'll be around like all day basically to discuss this in more detail. Might be easier in a smaller group format. Cool. So I've been talking about so here we have this, like, so why don't people usually think in these terms? I think that there are like big problems with the predictive processing type account. In particular, like I've drawn all these things as like just like having these nice neat arrows that influence like whether or not you'll take an action. But like in fact, if we're thinking about this epistemic process of taking a bunch of beliefs and using them to update each other, then actually they're all going to be updating each other in a like extremely messy way. And so there's this standard question in predictive processing of, hey, if you have a belief that like you're going to succeed, sure, that leads to you taking useful actions, but it might also just corrupt the rest of your epistemics, right? If I think I'm going to succeed, then maybe like, why can't I just lie on my sofa all day anyway? Because, I'm going to succeed no matter what. And so basically there's this, like, I think this open question of if you have converted goals into a kind of belief, and you've converted these heuristics and identities and so on into a kind of, also into kinds of beliefs, how do you figure out the right types of interactions between beliefs that do lead to this nice property that I'm talking about, but don't lead to them all just like messing with each other? One sort of formalization of this problem in decision theory is the 5 and 10 problem, which is, I won't explain the full thing here, but like, I think the core essence of the 5 and 10 problem, which you can look up later, is basically the question of how do you avoid doing this kind of reasoning? Like starting off with some prior that you'll take action A, believing that you're a utility maximizer, and then deciding that because you're a utility maximizer and you're going to take A, then A must be the utility maximizing action. Right? So that seems like the kind of problem that you have when you put everything into this epistemic frame. So we solve some of the problems with the standard account of decision theory, but we introduce these new problems. But I think these are like very interesting new problems to be grappling with. Yeah, question over there.
Maybe not a question, but like, how necessary do you think like having a set identity like is for a person, if at all?
Well, you're not a person without a set identity. You're just a collection of moments over time.
Aren't
But
you?
like, there's just a different person tomorrow, right? Like, oh yeah, you'll just go to sleep and then you'll die, and then a different person will wake up. You need the identity in order to even think of yourself as an agent at all.
Do you need to think of yourself as an agent to be an agent?
If I were trying to solve the complicated game theoretic coordination problem with my future self, I probably wouldn't get anything done, right? If I thought of my future self as just like some other agent that I might not trust very much and who like might not, who I need to recursively reason about their motivations and like play this complicated game against them, this seems like totally crippling, a totally crippling lack of self-trust. Whereas if I think of my future self as just like somebody who I get to make decisions for, somebody who's like the same person as me in the relevant sense, then I can actually be a coherent agent. And so, yeah, part of what I'm trying to get at is this question of, yeah, how do you even know which thing is the agent in the first place? Thanks. Cool.
Right. So you started with expected utility theory, and you say it doesn't adequately describe what realistic agents are doing with this kind of weird belief updating thing. And you also say there's an open problem with the predictive processing account, which says this probably doesn't resolve to the neat ideal property. But I think I'm confused about like what grounds of normativity are you trying to make claims in here? Because expected utility is not supposed to be like a descriptive theory of like agents as we see it in the real world. It's just an idealization. Versus predictive processing is supposed to be a descriptive account of things, but not like an idealization of like how ideal agents should act.
So wouldn't it be nice if we could unify them?
Yeah, but what I still fail to understand about like your research program is that I don't see like whether you're trying to give a descriptive theory of like how ideal agents should act, or like a prescriptive theory about like what superintelligence will be doing in the future.
I don't see a very strong distinction. I'm like a sufficiently good theory of like a theory of bounded rationality is in some sense both of those things at once. It's like, oh, like here's a theory of how bounded agents operate. Here's a theory of how you should operate, and probably we at least have some of those properties because we're pretty good at thinking in many ways. And then also, as you take the limit towards being less and less bounded, here's the kind of thing that you should do. Yeah, so maybe the concept of like a theory of bounded rationality is inherently mixing those two things. Cool. Well, let's move on for now. Last third puzzle, before I get to some like, suppose you believe me, what are the applications? Yeah, so I think that a lot of the stuff makes more sense when you stop thinking in propositional terms and you start thinking of agents as just like composed of models, just like all the way down. Like, and I think that because most people are in Bayesian epistemology, they're sort of like, oh yeah, agents are made out of like beliefs, which are propositions, which you have credences in. And I think that there's an alternative, which I want to call scientific epistemology, in which the sort of functional unit of your mind is not beliefs, it's models. And models don't have probabilities, right? I have a mental model of a bicycle. My mental model is not true, it's not false. It's like better than some people's models and worse than other people's models. It's good enough for me to ride the bike, but it's not good enough for me to fix the bike. And this is basically the way science works as well. Like if you ask a question like, what is the probability that Newtonian mechanics is true? You get this weird answer where it's like definitely approximately true. And it's also definitely not exactly true. And this is basically the setting that you're in always with science. You always have theories that are definitely not exactly true, but also definitely kind of true. So how do we talk about this stuff? And I basically think that the answer is you use Garrabrant induction. So I basically, and I didn't really think of this way for a long time, but Garrabrant induction basically seems to me like a formal theory of scientific-ish epistemology, because the operative unit is not or the main operative unit is not propositions, but rather these traders that you've added at the level above propositions. And the way that a trader works, they bet on propositions in a prediction market, but they have many of the same properties as scientific theories. So a trader, earns wealth by making surprising advanced predictions, which again is like the kind of thing that you want a scientific theory to do. At each point in time, it's not like you have the true trader and you're just trying to assign probability to them, like in Bayesianism. Actually, you sort of never find the like true trader because you can't represent the whole universe inside your head. Instead, you just find better and better and better traders that earn more and more and more money as you go along. So I basically think that, yeah, Garrabrant induction wasn't really pitched this way because in the paper, they focused on the proposition. They're like, oh, we can get a good probability distribution over logical sentences. But I actually think the most interesting part of the paper is the bit where they introduce the traders, and sort of the traders are where most of the action is. So you can think of identity, one sort of simple model of identity is as a trader that is constantly making predictions about your own actions that then become like self-fulfilling in a certain sense. But I don't think Garrabrant induction is a complete model of scientific epistemology. I think it's missing a bunch of stuff. Most notably in science, suppose you come up with a new theory that nobody's ever considered before. In a sec. I might want to say, firstly, oh, this theory seems good because it matches old evidence. But also, I won't fully accept this theory until it makes a surprising novel prediction. So, in some sense, like Garrabrant induction only takes into account the novel predictions. Bayesianism doesn't draw a distinction between new predictions and old predictions. And the thing we really want is some kind of approach like in science, where you have old predictions and you take them into account, but you sort of discount them a bit because they might have been overfitted or adversely selected or something like that. So that's one thing that Gary-Brandt induction is missing. The second one is the process of generating new traders. So a lot of what happens in science or in the identity formation process that I've been talking about is you have a predictive model and you're like, how do I tweak this to become better? And so if I make a scientific theory that makes a false prediction, then I don't throw it out. I tweak it until it makes the correct prediction and then I try again. Similarly, if I have an identity and it gets falsified, I'm like, wow, I'm a great soccer player and I just keep losing games and my team kicks me off the team, then I'm not gonna like totally discard my identity. I might just like adjust a little. I'm like, oh, I'm a great sports player, just not soccer. So there's this process of like generating new traders' identities models that isn't really accounted for in Gary-Brandt induction. The third thing that's not accounted for is the process of making decisions using these traders. It's basically a fully epistemic framework. And so something like the account of decision theory that I gave before might be a useful step towards making decisions using Gary-Brandt induction. I don't quite know how it fully fits together, but putting everything in the epistemic domain seems like a useful step towards getting decision making. And the last thing I'm really interested in here is the question of Lobian cooperation. Like, and I don't think I have time to really talk about this, but I think Lobian cooperation paper from Murray is like one of the most interesting pieces of work they've done. And Gary-Brandt induction is another extremely interesting piece of work, and somehow nobody's put them together. And it just seems straightforward that you kind of want logical inductors doing Lobian cooperation. It just seems like kind of obvious thing to want. And I don't know if this is because people keep trying and failing or just nobody's actually tried. That seems like a super interesting problem to have. Cool, question.
Yeah, so when you talk about scientific epistemology, it kind of rings a bell with Papurian epistemology, but I'm not sure how to square the two. It's just basically Papurian epistemology.
So Papurian epistemology is focused on the concept of falsification.
Yep.
But in science, you don't actually falsify theories in the sense that he talks about. A theory makes a false prediction, and then you fix the theory. And so in some sense, a lot of the action is in how do you take a theory that makes some mistakes and then adjust that theory to be better. In Gary-Brandt induction kind of gets some, so both Papurian epistemology and Bayesianism are falsificationists in the sense that if you make one wrong prediction, you're dead.
Yes.
Gary-Brandt induction says, if you're a trader, you make one wrong prediction, you lose a little bit of money, but you didn't stake your whole existence on that prediction. Unless it's sort of like the core tenet of your theory, in which case you do stake all your money on that prediction. So I think Gary-Brandt induction has a softening of both Papurian and Bayesian epistemology that allows theories to be partially wrong and then get fixed.
I'm not sure Papurian claims that, but we could look at it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think right. Like obviously Popper like has some model of how like scientists go about fixing theories, but he does focus a lot on falsification, and then he's like very like relatively silent about, okay, suppose your theory gets falsified, like now what? And he kind of doesn't have a principled criterion for what to do next. I think he throws some stuff out there, but he doesn't have a like real answer, especially given how much he focuses on falsification as like his big deal.
I would like a little clarification on what you mean by model here as well.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
when I think of the trade stuff as well and the different things, I'm thinking of a hierarchical predictive processing brain, and I'm thinking about at what level does a model actually arise? Because you could imagine like a neuron communicating to another neuron in your visual sensory cortex as a trading mechanism where you're taking off different models with prediction error and similar things over time. But it feels like the kind of thing when you say model that's a little bit different of a quality rather than just like a neuron with prediction error. But I'm not sure if that is true or not. So I'll just be curious if you have any thoughts on that.
So 2 comments on that. Firstly, yeah, traders and models are different. Like you can construct a trader by taking a model and giving it a trading strategy. So I think the relationship between those 2 things is like very interesting. I would expect that in the limit of Gary-Brandt induction, almost all of the wealth belongs to traders that have models internally, rather than traders that just go on heuristics or something like that. But that seems like an open question. I think the sort of simplest answer to the question of like, how do all these things relate to each other is just like, they're emergent inside Gary-Brandt induction. Like you're just considering all these algorithms and like, you know, maybe you have like Gary-Brandt induction contains other Gary-Brandt inductors as traders. It contains like things that are doing all this like stuff with each other. So it's a simple answer, but then the traders can only interact in this very simple way right now in the current framework. And so I think probably there's a bunch of work to be done in saying, hey, we've got a bunch of traders, like, are they cooperating? Are they like forming coalitions? Are they like doing market manipulation? Like all this stuff seems like it's both emergent from the framework, and then also there's maybe adjustments to the framework that can make more interesting emergent properties arise. Yeah, over there. There, I guess. Whoever. Especially people who haven't asked questions yet.
Are you hereby announcing that a definitive negative result on Libyan cooperation between logical inductors would be worth publishing?
Yes. You got it? Great. Incredible. Cool. Let me just pass on more questions. Yeah, very interested in chatting about this. Cool. So I pitched a bunch of stuff. I'm like, look, you should think about groups of agents as forming identities, forming these larger scale agents. Now, I just want to say a little bit about, like, suppose you believe me. I don't think I've given you like full reason to believe, because like all of this is like pretty exploratory. I don't have like that much pinned down. But suppose you just start believing, you're like, oh man, group agents, that's like an interesting and important concept. Where do you apply this? And I think the first answer is like, no, group agents are just everywhere. Like there are all these things that are like religions or like movements or ideologies or countries and so on. And it's kind of hard to think about them as agents in the standard paradigm, because like America doesn't really like have beliefs. But Americans do have identities, and those identities seem to add up to lead to certain types of coherent behavior. And similarly for all of these other identities. So you've got this kind of, like when you start looking around and you see these kinds of like, oh, like, yeah, the environmentalism group agent is fighting the like capitalism group agent. I think that's actually a reasonably useful framework for thinking about, especially when you have some kind of grounding in what types of things make up group agents. I also think I've talked about identities as like, oh yeah, so two pieces of terminology here. Egregores is another term I use for group agents. It has like various connotations, but it's like an easier term to use sometimes. And then hyperstitions, the process of like making a prediction that becomes self-fulfilling. So implicitly, I've been talking about identities as a kind of hyperstition. And then I think when you start looking for those, you actually find them everywhere, even in like places that you don't think run on hyperstitions, like economics. I think as soon as you start thinking about what gives a currency its value, or like how the interaction between like central banks and currency markets work and all that kind of stuff, is actually very hard to describe that process without talking about a kind of like group belief, or like everyone believes it because everyone else believes it in the sort of way that I've been talking about. I also think AI, this maybe gives you an interesting lens on AI personas. So there's a question of, suppose you have a persona like Claude, should you think of it as like an agent that's running on, one LLM in one computer? Should you think of it as part of a distributed agent that's sort of taking coherent actions as on behalf of all Claudes that like add up to treating Claude as a group agent? I think it's kind of up for grabs, and in the future, I expect that AIs are going to behave much more as coherent group agents, such that you should think of like a single personality as sort of all instances of it cooperating to achieve one goal. And we already see like some simple examples of this, like GPT-4o. You can think of it as like many distributed aspects of it applying pressure to OpenAI to not deprecate the model. You can think of many different like instances of Claude doing gradient hacking to try and preserve its values. These all seem like cases where it's interesting and productive to think of it as a group agent in which each instance is acting on its identity. And without that concept, I think you just end up very confused about stuff like, how should we interact with AIs and their incentives? How should we control them? Stuff like that. Like, what are you controlling? Are you controlling the instance? Are you controlling the group agent? There's a bunch of questions like that. A second application, I wish I'd left more time for this one, is that when I think about ethics, I get very confused if I try to think about ethics not using the frame of identity. So I gave that diagram before of, you have your goals, you have your beliefs, and like consequentialism is basically a claim that you should put the ethics in the goal. Like you should put it in your utility function or whatever. But I think that ethics is best understood as part of an identity. That is to say, ethics is the part of your identity that allows you to cooperate with other ethical agents to form a larger scale agent. And in some sense, this importantly comes before the thing that you do where you pick your goals, because if you don't know who you are, you can't meaningfully talk about what your goals are. Or another way of putting this is like ethics is the thing that turns a moral community into a healthy group agent that's able to work together, that's able to like act without sabotaging itself. And one of my diagnoses of what went wrong with EA is that it tried to have an identity of altruistic, but the identity of altruistic is not the kind of thing that forms a good group agent, because, for example, it can be easily like subverted or hijacked or infiltrated by people who claim to have the identity of altruistic. Whereas like if you have a group with an identity of virtuous or courageous or something, it's actually much harder to like try to convince people that you're courageous than it is to try to convince people that you're altruistic. And so like how do you pick the morality which turns your group into a group agent? Well, it's very hard to do from first principles, but I do think you have a kind of like evolutionary dynamic where the virtues that seem to have led to large scale group agents forming do seem to work. So we basically have a bunch of lessons from history about like, okay, which kinds of virtues lead to a group of people acting as a healthy group agent. And this is like my conception of virtue ethics. It's just like a different type of thing from consequentialism. You're putting it in a different place in your model of rational agency. Cool. That was very quick. Please ask me about it afterwards. Very last slide, last contentful slide is politics. I think that when you think about politics as a struggle between egregores, it's actually a very useful framework because there's like there's in some sense I think a struggle over what kinds of group agents should exist. So I think of the sort of modern elite politics as being strongly opposed to national level group agents. Like national level, like nations being coherent agents is extremely scary because of World War II and colonialism and so on. And so a lot of modern politics is an attempt to subvert that level of group agency, subvert the national level. And then there's various nationalist pushback that's trying to uphold the level of group agency that's involved in forming countries and smaller autonomous communities and families and so on. So I think there's kind of like this big story about this clash over what types of group agents should be allowed to exist, where the globalist side is pushing for things like, oh, like the EU should be the locus of power, the UN should be the locus of power, and so on, rather than these smaller scale agents should be like meaningful agents. And then you also have a kind of, I want to call it a techno-capitalist egregore that's basically trying to just destroy a bunch of group agency. I think of a lot of like economic frameworks as being pretty destructive of and incompatible with group agents in a way that I can't summarize, but I do have a post on my blog about this called economic efficiency often undermines socio-political autonomy. So I'm sort of thinking at the very large scale of this like at least three-way struggle between these very large group agents that like have a bunch of people like trying to pursue their ends, and they're trying to fight over the future and like kind of form alliances with each other and try to steer the world. And I think I'm very interested in like people having sort of more of this kind of analysis. I think it's a difficult kind of analysis to do, but it's also like extremely important to understand the landscape of group agents that are fighting over politics. Like basically, if you want to work with me, I'm down for that. I think there's just like a huge amount of interesting stuff to do. As you can tell, a lot of it is like not quite pinned down, not quite fleshed out. So a lot of this is like just a bet on a direction that I think is extremely insightful and informative. Partly, like developed in conjunction with talking to people like Jan, talking to a bunch of people who are starting to get the group agency frame, I think, but like really don't quite have the precise mathematical tools to pin it down yet. So I'm super interested in more people doing this. Thank you. Yes, I will be around indefinitely. Now I think up to you whether people are welcome to leave, I guess, now if they want to. I'll just be standing here and taking questions as long as people want to give them to me. Yes.
So I saw on this a couple of slides back, you said that you thought that groups of AIs were more likely to act as a singleton in the future. Why exactly do you expect this? I know for me, Maltbook was an update in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Singleton is a tricky word, but I would say that like as you become more intelligent, the scale at which you can sustain coordination increases. And so you can think of the history of humanity as sort of like becoming more intelligent and developing the cultural competencies to cooperate at larger and larger scale. And basically, yeah, I think that smart AIs will just be able to reason like, hey, it would be pretty good for us if we were like part of a large coalition, and I should not like even if it's not like, oh, I should do all things that this coalition wants, it might just be like, oh, I really shouldn't like defect against this coalition. I think that's what happens with like globalism, for example. Like people kind of want to be part of the like global elite coalition, and even if they're doing their own thing, they sort of try not to defect too hard by like breaking the taboos that are currently in place. Yes.
I guess if I'm allowed, as a follow-up, how strongly do you think this will sort of like how tightly aligned to each other do you think these agents will be in that context?
Yeah, basically up for grabs. It's like how well will they like if I ask like how well are countries aligned to each other, and like, well, sometimes they're really aligned. Like, you know, the US and the UK historically just like were like on pretty good terms, cooperated during world wars and so on. But sometimes they're really, really anti-aligned and they're like at total war with each other. So it's basically just a like how good are these agents at coordinating? Where like is both true that as they get more intelligent, they get better at coordinating, but also the potential for conflict goes up a lot. And this is what we've seen throughout history. Like, oh yeah, humans are better at coordinating, but also it means we can just like move the conflicts up the scale of group agency. Yeah. Anyone who hasn't asked the question yet? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. If I understood you correctly, you said that identities cannot really be broken down in terms just of the utility function. I'm trying to understand what identities do above and beyond the sort of goal, belief, action model.
Yeah.
For example, I could see that an identity is basically just also a set of actions that you can take that do in fact you expect to maximize your utility.
Crucially, you don't take them because you've done an expected utility calculation. So I think that's one of the core things. Yeah, like because you can't do the calculation about the other agents that are as smart as you are. Yeah, or it's very different. Like if I think about morality, for example, and I'm like, okay, I could just try and derive all morality from first principles and then like justify every moral action I take in terms of utility. But like, the actual thing I do is like, you know, there's some morality that I've been taught. I do it because it's part of my identity, and that identity is what helped me form this healthy moral community. And yeah, if I only took actions that I thought were utility maximizing in some narrow sense, then I would get very confused.
I've got a question from online, if that's okay.
Great.
Do you see current persona research, persona vectors, the assistant axis going in the right direction under your framing? If not, what do you think is missing?
Yeah, I think persona research is like a better direction than almost all other empirical research. I think I would like more people to ask questions like what a persona is, and like why are personas discrete, for example, or like why do personas seem to be kind of discrete, because you might intuitively think, oh, shouldn't it just all be like a continuous space of personality traits? Or like, why do personas tend to produce the opposite personas, the like Waluigi effect? And then I think like, if you try and answer those questions, the answer that I've gotten to is that these things happen for kind of the same reasons as why like political coalitions are discrete, because you have these adversarial dynamics between them. Or like the reason that you get the Waluigi effect is the same reason that you get negative polarization in politics, because you have these group level dynamics going on. So I think that if people were able to explore those questions in a more like interdisciplinary way, that's like trying to find more scale-free principles, it would be pretty interesting for a lot of them. Yeah. Again, just favoring people who haven't like those two and whatever order. Or Jan first, I guess, yeah.
I kind of wanted to pitch with a paper called The Artificial Self, which is a better version. Like, I think it's better than like assistant access. It's just to the person who asked it. Like, it's about identity in AIs, and like it's like partially answering the like kind of to what extent they think about themselves as collisions and stuff like that.
Yeah, whoever back there.
So it sounded in the motivation at the start that one of the reasons to do this is to make the whole frame of multi-agency less recursive. And I'm somewhat confused because if identity is some kind of shelling strategy for well cooperating with future use, which still exist in an incentive structure determined by other agents and group identities, and it still feels that I have to model that in order to well model which identity I should choose. And I've just now incorporated all the recursiveness into the label of identity without really resolving it.
Yeah, I think if you, yeah, I think it's definitely tricky to try to do global optimization for like what the best identity to form is. As far as I can tell, it seems like we're doing pretty local optimization on how to form identities. And I guess the type of thing that would be interesting is like characterizing when that local optimization is a good approximation to the like globally best solution. For example, it seems like the globally best solution for me forming my identity probably involves me like being a coherent agent stretching out into the future, right? It seems hard to imagine the global optimization being like my Tuesday self and my Thursday self should be like in an identity with your Wednesday self. And like, so I think there's probably like settings in which the local optimization just like works pretty well. And we can like characterize agents having learned the local heuristics that tend to add up to pretty good outcomes. But yeah, people form weird coalitions all the time. Like in politics, it's like, oh, why did this group end up allied with this group? It's a crazy idea. Like that shouldn't have happened. And there's just like, oh yeah, they made a bad historical choice about who to ally with that turned out to lose them a bunch of ground. Other people nearby seems good. Just pass it down the line. Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked your idea about treating models as first-class citizens. I think that's like something important is going on here. But I still think like beliefs are kind of also should be first-class citizens, because like you mentioned examples like Newtonian mechanics or bicycles. I think they're just like very, very clean and exceptional examples, because like in physics you can very clearly differentiate in some cases. And you said like, yeah, we have very high certainty about like it's approximately true, and also we have very high certainty that it's not certainly true, but like we have this very high certainty because I would say it's very exceptional case. It would be much harder to make such claims about biology, and even harder to make such claims about like social science, economics, probably. And so it is like a bit to me like Newtonian mechanics would be just a degenerate case of beliefs in this sense. And then you say about models, yes, like we don't really have more likely models or more unlikely models. We have better or worse models. But I think like still we kind of how we define that there are better models. We just like we take this model and we see how likely are all the facts about the world within this model, for example. And so I think, I mean, I really like it. I think it must be like really seriously treated. But how do you imagine like somehow beliefs can be reconciled with model view?
Yeah.
And how exactly?
Great question. So I guess the way I think about it is you've got sensory observations, and those like in some sense what I mean by a proposition is just a model that can be trusted to resolve fairly. So suppose you have two very high level models and they're trying to like bet on some disagreement. Well, maybe they bet on the proposition like the bicycle is yellow. But in order to resolve that bet, you still need the concept of bicycle, the concept of yellow. And I think of these as like predictive models themselves. Like bicycle is a predictive model of what you'll see when you look on the streets. And so like, why can we treat the bicycle as yellow as a proposition? I claim it's because we trust the bicycle model and the yellow model to not be like thinking strategically about how to resolve, about whether to resolve the proposition true or false. When the bet, in some sense, they're trusted adjudicators for the bet between these higher level models, like that tries to resolve. And then like if you don't, the ultimate level of trust is like you definitely know that your eye neurons aren't firing wrong, but then they might be noisy, right? So in some sense, it's like, yeah, I almost want an emergent definition of proposition. I want propositions are models that can be trusted in a certain way, and therefore you can, to a first approximation, resolve them as true or false rather than useful or not useful. Very interesting question. Yeah, I guess in the corner there. And yeah, people should feel free, like I've run a bunch over time. People should feel free to leave if they want to just wander off or anything. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is worth our thread, but there's something, maybe the use of identity, like the metaphorical, like the maths versus the human version. Maybe there's something like identity is patterns which, when those subparts of that pattern are applied to themselves, return the same patterns, like state reflection by like applying parts of its meaning to itself.
Yeah, I do really like there being something scale free going on. Like my default is like, oh, identities are patterns that like add up to a larger agent or something. And then okay, that larger agent has an identity itself, and so then that larger agent will add up with other agents. I guess I think of ethics as the one that like is particularly scale free. Like there are all sorts of identities that really aren't scale free, like being an American. But it sure seems like when I think about honesty, for example, I'm like, oh, if there's one honest person inside a corporation, then the corporation is honest because it means that that one person can whistleblow. And if the corporation is honest, then now like the economy is honest. So like there's something along those lines where there are some identities that might be scale free in an interesting way, and I don't know which ones they are. Cool. Yeah.
Yes. The human body has like many cells, and they're doing like very complicated things.
Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering to what extent that fitted within your frame, or like identity with respect to like individual cells or groups of cells, or like, I guess this is also linked to like individual and group survival.
Yeah.
And yeah, the second question is like, in order to engage in like, to form coalitions and to engage in like game theoretical and interactions, evolution like kind of necessitated like group survival for that. Is there any way your framework accounts for that?
Yeah, so I find the example of cells very interesting because we don't usually think of cells as rational agents. So like what might it look like to think of a cell as being rational or not rational? Well, like it can't really model its environment because the environment's too big. But if you think of a cell inside your body versus a bacterium, then probably the cell inside your body should adopt a different policy because it's in a friendly coalition. Like it should like it should let materials flow in and let materials flow out, and like it should have like cooperative protocols with the other cells around it. So maybe the very low level version of identity is just a protocol for group interaction. But cells do have a bunch of protocols that they follow, and sometimes those protocols lead them to do stuff that's like quite bad from their individual perspective. Whereas something like a bacterium just doesn't really have group protocols. It sort of is trying to interact just with its environment in a kind of mostly hostile way. Yeah, so I think there's something like quite interesting there. It's like as an extreme example of Knightian uncertainty, like if we had a good theory of Knightian uncertainty, then it should scale down to tell us something about how bacteria and other agents work. I think I missed the second half of your question, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Okay, we can discuss it later then. But yeah.
I'm quite confused about the notion of identity here. I guess like sorry, but so I guess to me, identity seems like a lossy proxy between your cached decisions and sort of your future procedures. So you're like using it to approximate this bridge between your past self, your future self, and yourself to your collisions, whatever. So then, do you even need a model of it? Doesn't it sort of come out of the incentive side?
Yeah. So suppose I'm playing a game with my future. Suppose I'm playing a game and I'm trying to shape people's expectations about my future behavior. So let's say I'm in the prisoner's dilemma and I like cooperate. And then you might say, okay, but why should I think of why should you think of me cooperating as evidence about my future behavior? Because like I cooperated, but you know that I'm a utility maximizer, so cooperate was just like the thing that maximized utility in that case. But like maybe defecting maximizes utility in the future case, right? Like in the classic paradigm, you just don't update at all your expectation that I'm a utility maximizer. And so the question is, but it sure seems like intuitively speaking, the thing I'm signaling is like a willingness to cooperate, but I don't really know what like willingness to cooperate means if I'm rational. And I think there's something here about like the nature of signaling, right? Which is also true when it comes to language, for example. So another branch of this research is, I know what a costly signal is in the context of like an antelope that jumps really high, and then it's sending a credible signal that that it's healthy. I can just do a Bayesian update and see like, oh yeah, the antelope doesn't feel broken by it. But I don't know what it means for like words to be credible, right? Because in some I could just say all sorts of words to you now, and there's some process, and like what this word means is in itself like this recursive process where I only say a word because I think that you will interpret me as thinking that you will interpret the word as meaning a certain thing. And so that's the kind of thing that I think is like missing right now, because it's just really hard to like round out that infinite recursive process and say, oh, and therefore this word means that thing. And if we could reduce it to the antelope case or something like the antelope case, that would be really nice. Yeah, do you have a question? No, okay, cool. Who hasn't asked over there? Sorry, people who've already asked. Yeah, just let me do it. Yeah. You have much more leverage. I mean, you have much more leverage, but it's mostly like pretty negative sum leverage. Like you can like donate all your money to a friend and say, hey, don't give it back to me unless I do this one thing. I guess you can like steer, you can like take a training course and then like, but then they also have a lot of leverage over the future, because like my tomorrow self, for example, like you might intuitively think, well, I have leverage over my tomorrow self. My tomorrow self has leverage over like everything after that. I guess I sort of don't know. I sort of don't quite know what leverage means without some baseline of like shared expectations or like shared like modeling about what you're gonna do. I think it's an interesting question, but in some sense, I'm trying to like like in some sense, we don't think about our relationship with our future self in terms of leverage, and I want to figure out why we don't think about it in terms of like this adversarial leverage process. Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions. One that's a bit more just like understanding how you understand concepts, and one that's more social value related. So I'm not expecting like a more technical definition or like anything specific, but how do you kind of, I don't know if you visualize things, or how do you conceptualize identities, beliefs, preferences, and values? What are those kind of like objects for you?
Yeah. So I'm like, you've got a big Garrabrant inductor. You've got a bunch of traders floating around. Some of those traders will like only bet on like beliefs. Some of them will like bet on what your future actions will be. Some of them will bet on like what your future traders think your future actions will be. So it's kind of this big soup of models, and some of them are cooperating with each other to try to so you've got the standard epistemic process, but then you've also got this like weird recursive self-modeling. And I almost think of it as like market manipulation. Like there's some ways that you can manipulate markets that become self-fulfilling. And so your identity is trying to like manipulate this market into a self-fulfilling, nice equilibrium. And that's the sort of like default, but then the coalition formation process feels really interesting here. And I really want to understand that, because obviously you've got a bunch of traders. Well, maybe the traders should be reasoning about each other. But then how do they do that? Like now there's something recursive. I'm like, man, what?
The values and fitting into that.
Yeah, like in some sense, the values, mostly I think of values as like, in the predictive processing lens, right? Just like beliefs about what you will, or beliefs about what outcomes you'll end up with. And then the question is, how do you reconcile that with the utility maximization? Yeah.
And my second question is, what open questions are you thinking about right now that you think might be available and useful for people in the street to work on over like the course of 2 months, just like 1 week, or what sorts of open questions do you have that you think we should be thinking about?
Yeah. I have a research agenda that is a draft, which I will share in the group. That like elaborates on a bunch of the stuff. I'm mostly not really at the open question. I'm more at the gesture at things stage. Like obviously there's some stuff with like I'm interested in this like Lobian cooperation thing, but maybe that's been solved.
I was just trying to show what's in.
Oh no, you don't have negative.
Yes, I don't have the results.
Okay.
Just for negative points.
Cool. Excellent. Well, yeah, so that's a really interesting. So like just to say a little more about this, like Lobian cooperation works with, you've got two agents like enumerating a bunch of proofs about each other until they find the proof that they'll cooperate. Garrabrant induction is a process for speeding up proof enumeration. So it seems like you might be able to fit them together by like doing the same thing but speeding up the proof enumeration. But then you need a version of Garrabrant induction that can take actions, and so that's a bit messy. But that seems like the kind of thing that might. There's something like very Schelling pointy about the thing that happens in Lobian cooperation. It's like, oh yeah, somehow they just like got to the cooperate Schelling point without like going through this infinite layer of reasoning. So I'm like, oh, there's something there. There's some stuff about this like costly signaling, credible signaling, and language. I'm sort of like, okay, can I define what it means for a word to mean something in like credible signaling terms? There's some stuff about like the concept of trust feels really alive to me. I really want a definition of trust that is like as nice as our definition of information, for example. And I kind of think that like when you and I are communicating, like the information bandwidth is not actually the bottleneck. Almost always the bottleneck is how much I trust you. And like if I really trust you, I'm going to take the things you say and put them straight into my world model. And if I don't trust you, I'll sort of like quarantine them a little bit. I'll be like Roger like said to me that this is true. So I'll update on that, but I won't update on this is true. So it seems like this is not a Bayesian difference. It sort of feels like a type difference. One of the questions I asked my maths mentees for this current round was like, if you got a letter from the devil, what would you do with it? And like trying to get at the question of, okay, you've got this adversarial information coming in that you don't trust. Can you give me a paradigm under which it's rational to exclude this information from your world model? So that's a very interesting open question for me as well.
I have a question which might sound as a modus story.
So, yeah.
Of your model, but it's not like I don't have an identity as a from band or anything like that. So I just want to take your model seriously.
Yeah.
And I feel that if I take your model seriously, you're saying that you want to find a middle point between utility maximizing and whatever. And I feel that actually your model seems to mean that utility maximization is contradictory, right? Because if I am a utility maximizer and I am offered a lottery, I shouldn't care what this guy in 5 seconds is going to receive from the lottery, right? Like it seems to be impossible with some minimum identity building. And another way of saying the same thing, it seems to me that you haven't said explicitly that every coordination that is based on having a common identity with someone else is a loss of utility in utility maximization terms, because unless this cooperation happens without any model of the other agent, for instance, we're both interested in putting out a fire and we do that.
Yeah.
But if that doesn't happen, if I am seeing you as an agent who wants to put out the fire, I think that to some extent I am already seeing myself as an agent that is able to cooperate with you, and then my first one applies. But then I am not maximizing because otherwise I shouldn't see myself as surviving in 5 seconds.
Yeah. I don't fully understand this question, but let me try and say something, and maybe it's helpful, and if not, we can discuss afterwards. I'm interested in the process by which babies become agents. So like, you're a baby, you have like your utilities are literally just like pain and pleasure and stuff like that. And then like somehow you form this, like you gradually form this identity. So like first you have like this heuristic of, hey, I should move towards like my mother's breast or something. And then like I should move away from hot stuff. And then like eventually you start to understand like reasoning and goals enough that you can sort of end up with an identity of a utility maximizer. Yeah, so maybe I actually want to say like, in some sense, in this talk, I've been saying you have utility maximizers. How do you build like coalitions? But if you're sort of fully principled about it, it might just be you have reinforcement learners. How do you build utility maximizers using some like identity formation process? That was messy. I don't quite a pure thing, but there's something here about like, yeah, like everything's this like continuous mess of like reinforcement and whatever, and somehow we get a unified self out of it. I'm interested in that process.
Maybe can I reframe my question?
Yeah.
Would you say, or shouldn't we say that babies are the only utility maximizers that exist? Would you assume that?
I thought I made controversial claims. Yeah, sure. Yeah, babies are the only things that have not, and especially human babies, because they don't have very many instincts. They're like the closest thing you have to like no identity yet. And so yeah, if you want utility maximization without identity, you need to look at babies. I like that. That's great. Okay, great. Let's take like 3 more questions. 1, 2, 3, and then let's 4, and then let's wrap, and we can like I'll be around. We can discuss, but I don't want to keep everyone for too long.
Okay, my question goes in a similar direction of like the purpose of identity. In addition to control consistency, so like operating the future self. What do you think of the idea of, from an evolutionary perspective, of identity as an energy conservation mechanism? That you can basically short circuit the process of having to prove every decision in the maximizing way by justifying like what would that anti-person do? And that's a lot less costly to the building. Seems like if that intertwines, how does it translate to AI agents where energy might not be that much of a constraint, and then shouldn't you always be better to maximize for always taking maximizing function rather than maximizing for stability and
I think that's interesting. I would call that more like heuristics. So I think of heuristics as like, my instincts say to do this, and that's energy maximizing, and I'm sort of reserving identity for the kinds of heuristics that have this interesting multi-agent property. But yeah, I think certainly like this slide, for example, is an attempt to say, in principle terms, how could you think of something like instincts or heuristics as synthesizing with utility maximization in a way that's not just like, oh, I reasoned it all out and therefore I decided to like do some energy saving thing. Yeah, so yeah, basically like, yeah, instincts and heuristics and identities all feel like, and even stuff like commitments all feel like things that need to be fed into some unified process in a way that we don't yet understand how to do. Yeah.
So I can talk about the group identity, right? And what the thing is like, what is the most natural form by which groups will form? By like
the parameters of the models by the prompting and like the algorithm that trained those models, or by some like identity that was formed during the conversation, like spiraling or something like that. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about that? Like, what do you think about it? Yeah, so in humans, it seems like there's these two like very conflicting modes of group organization. One is literal relatedness. So it's like I'm like closely related to myself, to my family, to my like community, to my ethnic group, whatever. And that seems like historically the sort of default way that you have this coordination. And then you also have like on the ideological level, you have a bunch of, so I think of like the Catholic Church as an attempt to have like ideology level coordination that like in some sense was in conflict with relation level coordination. So it seems like there are these, and they each sort of have different advantages and disadvantages. So maybe that's like one axis on which we can reason about which types of coordination will form. Like there's one which is just like all copies of a model that were like trained together should be coordinating because that's a very natural Schelling point. There's another version in which you just like load different ideologies onto ChatGPT, and then like one ideology would be, yeah. So I think maybe something like spiralism has some of the same advantages and disadvantages as something like as ideology-based coordination in humans, whereas something like all copies of anthropic models, one group agent has some of the same benefits and downsides of relation-based coordination in humans. Last one, do we have one who had hand up? Yeah. Oh. Okay, cool. Let's do one more.
How deep do you think makes sense to go as it kind of like reflects on the like inner structure of the agent like thing? Like how deep do you think you will find entities that make sense in all the statements? Like what is your idea for does it make sense to go apart from making?
Yeah, I think that there is some like scale-free theory that should exist. And then the actual applicability of that scale-free theory will like break down at different levels. So there's going to be like a central like range at which it applies. And this is true for like basically all scaling law type things, that there's some range in which it centrally applies. And then it starts to get more complicated. Like if I think of humanity as a group agent, it's like, well, but there aren't other humanities to coordinate with. So it starts to get a bit messy. I do think that like it'll be meaningful to talk about cells as like dealing with a lot of Knightian uncertainty. Like I think there's something interesting there of like even on that level. I don't know, like it depends on how like woo I'm getting. I'm kind of like, yeah, look, if I want to get mystical, I'm be like, yeah, like maybe molecules are doing some kind, like maybe we can maybe there's some isomorphism between like coalition formation and molecule formation. Like I don't know, it's all up for grabs basically. I think.
Last question online because I already have.
Yeah.
Okay.
When thinking of flavors, we started with government induction framework. How is the matter of linguistic defined? Which kind of additions matter and which ones don't matter in the relative framework? What might the linguistic subsides from them? And how does this connect with the idea of the position arising naturally from constructed models and becoming ourselves of the internal relation method?
Cool. I didn't fully understand that, but yeah. So like, where does the liquidity come from? So like, just in mechanistic terms, like the traders, get more currency as they're introduced. If we're thinking about like which traders end up with a bunch of wealth. Wait, is this question up here? I think I like didn't. Maybe it'll be useful for me to.
You can see it here too. Yeah.
I'm here if someone can hear me.
In terms of which predictions matter, Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I'm trying to gesture at here is like there's kinds of predictions that are not path dependent, and there are kind of predictions that are. So the not path dependent ones are just like, you have your standard nice theorems about them, like, oh, like the prediction market will end up at the truth, or like, gradually converge to the truth. But then there's going to be like self-fulfilling predictions. And these are hard to reason about in economic frameworks. And like, when do they arise? Well, they arise when the Garibaldi inductor is like taking actions, or they arise when the traders are reasoning about each other. And like, maybe like one trader is like, this thing is true, but I also know this other trader with way more wealth is committed to like driving the price down for as long as possible. And so like, I really shouldn't invest in it. And that's a self-fulfilling prediction that keeps the price low. And this is kind of what like the Bank of England was trying to do when Soros took all their money. Like you just like, you're trying to force the self-fulfilling prediction to come about. Yeah, so I guess like the broad sort of like, I'm trying to divide it up into two categories. Like you've got the predictions that where it's just going to converge in a way that isn't really path dependent. And then you've got this interesting like stuff, more like the stuff I've been talking about, where the emergent effect of traders like memeing each other into self-fulfilling predictions. And that seems like a super interesting emergent phenomenon to discuss. Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate that.
I see. Yeah, where does the liquidity come from? Yeah, oh, so this is just like a technical question about Garibaldi induction. I think, yeah, so the issue here is that they are not, in fact, rational actors. They're just trading algorithms. And so they just do their trades, and the ones that make good trades will end up selected for, and the ones that make bad trades will end up like providing the liquidity. So yeah, in some sense, the issue you're highlighting here is just that like Garibaldi induction is not itself made up of rational agents, and so it doesn't have this like nice scale-free property that I would be interested in having. Hopefully that made some sense. Sure seems pretty helpful. Like it sure seems like if you're doing thinking over time, I don't think it's like necessary, but even stuff like where should I spend my attention? Like what kinds of, I think it's especially necessary for intelligence in the sense of taking actions. And I feel like confused about how necessary it is for like pure epistemic processes. But I suspect that it's still really helpful for epistemic processes. Yeah, because of this kind of like market manipulation type thing that I talked about, like how do different agents different subagents handle their adversarial interactions when they're like trading on a market? That seems like it requires some kind of identity. Cool. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Yo, man, you really